So let me start out by saying that this presentation was inspired by two events. The first is a conversation that I had with Lance on a cold fall evening standing by a fountain outside of a conference hotel, where he said that Leonard Cohen's work would be remembered long after the work of Bob Dylan. I still don't think he really meant this. Maybe we had a few drinks. But the other was the awarding of the Nobel Prize in Literature to Bob Dylan in 2016, which resulted, by the way, in a very well-attended New York Society for General Semantics panel discussion on the subject right here at this very venue. And after which, mind you, I still think that the fact that Dylan received that prize is more than just a little odd. But another quick point that I want to make as a prelude is to say that my interior life, when I am not doing other things and interacting with others, is made up of words and music, or alternately of music and words. This makes my experience somewhat different from most of you in this room, in that we all share one of these two habits or functions of mind, which is language making, but not the second. And this is why we're all gathered here today, the language part, right? Because general semantics is so much a matter of language, of what it is, what it allows and enables, but also what it befuddles and how and where it so often messes things up, or how we mess things up when we use it and rely on it and need it. Marshall McLuhan highlighted for us the difference between concepts and percepts. And both of these together create our maps, while the territory is that which we perceive and language about. And of course, what's paramount in all of this are the things that we perceive and language about when we interact with one another, particularly with some purpose or imperative, but also when we're left to our own devices and thinking to ourselves. I used to say, based on my vocation, that I am a right-brained person trying really hard to live and work in a left-brained world. As of late, though, I've realized that, and I've become more accepting of the fact that I'm very much bilateral, equally left and right-brained. I say this based on my limited understanding of how the brain works, but knowing that the brain's Broca's area, which is located in the left hemisphere, is associated with speech production and articulation. And the fact that thinking is effectively, for the most part, talking to ourselves in our heads. I say it based on my knowledge that there's no true music center in the brain. But I also say it based on my understanding that artistic, and thus musical creativity, is closely associated with both the right and lateral prefrontal cortex and the right neocortex, not to mention, to be fair and complete, follow me here, it's also based in the left ventral thalamus, the bilateral frontal temporal lobe, the anterior hippocampus, the bilateral temporal pole, the inferior temporal gyrus, and the MTG, or middle temporal gyrus, and the left amygdala. But wait, because language making, particularly think about writing, right? Thinking to write or thinking while writing is a creative act. What makes creativity in language making different from artistic creativity? I first began thinking about this somewhere around the third or fourth time that I read Suzanne Langer's Philosophy in a New Key. Most of you know that, I think know that Langer distinguishes all human symbol making and symbol use according to what are discursive and what are non-discursive, or what she termed presentational symbols. The discursive camp includes language and mathematics, which are linear and sequential in their nature and serve to allow or to enable logic, abstraction, and ideas. The presentational includes music, as well as dance, two-dimensional and three-dimensional art, architecture, the like, and these tend to be created and perceived holistically and simultaneously, and communicate, if one is fully open to the experience, what she calls forms of feeling. In her follow-up book, Feeling and Form, Langer addresses the one artistic form that was, to me, kind of glaringly left off that list, which is poetry. If language is discursive, but in poetry is used presentationally, does this blow up Langer's dichotomy? Or does it create a bridge? I'll admit that I have not read Feeling and Form as inside out, as I've read Philosophy in a New Key, but Langer spends an entire chapter in Feeling and Form on poesis. I don't have time in this context to dig into what a fascinating and confounding chapter this is, particularly coming from her, but let me cite 3 sentences she writes at the outset and which flew off the page for me. I quote, "It is the fashion of teachers of poetry today to begin by telling us that the word poet means maker. But what has the writer of a poem really made? An arrangement of words is no more a creation than the arrangement of plates on a table." Now, I don't wish to grossly misrepresent Langer with that soundbite of a statement. She writes a great deal about poetry and Feeling and Form, and I don't believe she does it justice. But she also writes on the page prior to the statement that I just read, she writes, and I quote, the leading questions of poetry criticism must be, what is the poet trying to say? And what is the poet trying to make us feel? Well, in response to this, I would quote Dylan and his icy retort in the Pennebecker documentary Don't Look Back to a reporter who asked him what one of his songs means. "Why are you asking me?" Of course, Dylan is not a poet. Well, in another filmed interview, he jokes, "I like to think of myself as a song and dance man." What he is, first and foremost, is a songwriter, an author of lyrics, and a composer of music, if we use ASCAPs, right, the American Society of Composers, Authors, and Publishers, if we use their terms. And so, a part of what I wish to do here today is to explain the essential difference between what we call poetry and what we call lyrics, to offer a definition of the difference. And then, calling upon Ted Williams' statement that the hardest thing to do in sports, without question, is to hit a baseball. The other part of what I want to do is present and support this thesis, that the hardest thing to do in the arts is to fuse words and music into a holism that is greater than the sum of its parts. Historically speaking, I'll root this discussion in 2 foundations, and of necessity, I need to be brief with this. The first is Greek poetry, which, as Milman Parry discovered for us in the first half of the previous century, was sung. The Homerian epics and the dramas and comedies of the Greek plays were sung. In these deepest known roots, however, the singing, the use and reliance on melody, is simply another mnemonic device to help commit to memory the story being told. The second foundation is the late medieval rise of the art form, that is opera. For while there are folk songs in the Western European tradition, and interestingly enough, the English registration of the broadside ballad Greensleeves predates the first Italian opera by less than 20 years. But it's opera that became the first institutionalized and thus commercial music art form of the mass media age that sprung forth from Gutenberg's printing press. Most importantly, though, it's both through balladeering and opera where we begin the tradition, wherein music is not simply a mnemonic device to remember the words. Instead, the music itself becomes memorable and worth remembering. Right? Think about it. Greensleeves was legally registered in 1580 AD as the intellectual property of a Richard Jones. In all probability, he didn't write it. In all probability, this haunting and memorable melody had been composed and was floating around long before music publishing began to evolve as an industry. But the fact is that here, 441 years later, you know it. You have known it since you were a child. You are in all likelihood humming the melody in your head right now. instead of listening to me. It is that memorable and recognizable. It is an archetype of song. You may even know some, if not most, of the words. And so it's from this point in the history of music, Western music, that we have an art form comprised of words and music combined, but combined for a different purpose than the word songs of ancient Greece. With opera, the story or book must be memorable and told in a memorable way, if that is, we aspire to create great art that is memorable, timeless, universal, and which leaves us having experienced something that speaks to our human condition. To what happens to the humans in the story, which is the content, but also to what humans can achieve in the telling of the story, the medium. With opera too, however, the music is equally important to the medium, to the telling of the story, and what makes it memorable, timeless, universal, and which leaves us thinking. And so the two are on equal footing. Even though for most people it is the language part that is our common denominator with respect to what we consider meaningful. And this is the very thing that's always attracted me to not only making music, but thinking about it, that it works its magic on you and communicates meaning to you even when you don't realize it, even if and when you are not a particularly musical person. But opera is not about words and music on equal but separate and distinct footing. If it were, we could talk about an opera with a great book, but average or below average music, or great music with a so-so book, right? And of course we could, but I would ask you, name one. I'll venture to guess that you can't. You can't, because it is lost to history, to be rediscovered and resurrected only through the tedious and not very worthwhile pursuits of some musicologist who toils to uncover and study that which no one otherwise remembers. And so my point is this: there's a third leg or foot to this equal footing. The third leg is that the book must be great and the music must be great, but that in addition, there must be a symbiosis wherein they not only fit perfectly or all but perfectly together, but wherein each enhances and elevates and makes more powerful the other, wherein, as the cliche goes, the whole is greater than the sum of the parts. To it, how is a song written? Are the words written first and the music second? Or is the music written first and the words added, or are both written simultaneously? The answer is yes. There is no one right way to do it, but let me take the tradition of two people, an author and a composer working together. And what a tradition that is, right? George and Ira Gershwin, Oscar Hammerstein and Jerome Kern, Yip Yarberg and Harold Arlen, Lorenz Hart and Richard Rodgers, who are always known in the reverse, Hal David and Burt Bacharach, Jerry Lieber and Mike Stoller, Mick Jagger and Keith Richards, Bernie Taupin and Elton John, Robert Hunter and Jerry Garcia. I could go on. Regardless of their working process, they all have a great many more failures than successes. Because if one fails, or when one fails, so does the other. If one comes up short, the whole of the enterprise comes up short. But if, as in the case of Bernie Taupin and Elton John, the process is words first and then music, Taupin never approached his work as a poet. He wrote his words with a sense of both rhythm and melody in his head. In the reverse case, Hal David and Burt Bacharach, for instance, is even more instructive because David received the melody and the arrangement and needed to come up not only with words that follow the melodic and rhythmic structure, but that speak to the nature of the song. What does the song tell him? How, as artifice, perhaps more so than inspiration, right? He's writing to a template. How does he determine what the song should say or needs to say? Well, to come to a close, so I have more time than I thought, but I'm going to come to a close. Let me return just for a moment to this battle for supremacy between Leonard Cohen and Bob Dylan. You can laugh. Leonard Cohen wrote, I have 5 minutes, so we can just, laugh. That's okay. Sorry, what? Does Lance get to respond to this, by the way? I don't care. Leonard Cohen wrote a great many songs. And note that I said a great many and not many great. One might also consider him justly the poet laureate of contemporary music of the late 60s and onward. I'll give him that. Dylan, on the other hand, has written more songs than I can count that are part of the vernacular of his time, many of which still ring out and ring on for us almost 60 years on. This is because Dylan is the more complete songwriter. Because even for us who tend to privilege language, the necessary human symbolic system, over the merely pretty, beautiful, moving, etc., but unnecessary one of music, it is about more than just words. It is about more than just words put to music. It is about a fusing of music and words that, as a symbolic enterprise, is bilateral, is holistic, is incredibly difficult to achieve, to create, I can't say envision, right? In ways that are both novel and great. And that really is necessary, if only because it has become over the ages such an integral part of all civilizations and of all of our collective human experience. It is discursive presentational as one word. It is words, music, or music, words as one. Thanks.